Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive with us. We've had a lot of requests to take a look at this one. The Rational Optimist, How Prosperity Evolves by Matt Ridley.
Oh, yeah, this one's been making the rounds.
It really has, and it's gotten some pretty strong praise too. The Wall Street Journal called it invigorating.
And the National Review said it was a triumph.
So, with a title like The Rational Optimist, it really begs the question. Can we actually be optimistic about the future? How has prosperity evolved over time? And that's exactly what we're going to be diving into today. Now we have our expert here with us, and let me tell you, I think they may have geeked out over this one just a little.
Well, Ridley really doesn't waste any time. He jumps right in, arguing that even with millions still living in poverty, we're living in an age with more access to resources, goods, and services than ever before.
Yeah, he brings up some stats that are pretty mind-blowing. Like by the middle of the century, it's predicted there will be almost 10 billion people on the planet.
Wow.
And that's a massive leap from just 10,000 years ago.
It's incredible, and he really emphasizes that it's not just about the numbers. Even the poor are getting richer and at a faster rate than the global average. He uses China as a really compelling example. I mean, they've seen a 10-fold increase in wealth in just 50 years, and with that comes longer lifespans and lower birth rates.
So it sounds like he's painting a very different picture than the doom and gloom we hear so often these days.
Mm-hmm.
But is he saying that inequality is just gone?
No, not exactly. He does acknowledge that inequality still exists, but he argues that it's actually declining globally. To illustrate this point, he compares living conditions from back in 1890 described in Jacob Riis's book, How the Other Half Lives. You know, the one that exposed those horrific conditions in New York City's slums. He argues that those conditions would have been unthinkable just a few decades later in the mid-20th century.
Wow. Yeah, that is a pretty stark contrast. So where does Ridley see this upward trend beginning? Like, when did things start to shift?
He takes us way back to the very beginnings of humanity. You know, like 500,000 years ago when early humans were crafting hand axes. And back then, every individual had to make their own tools. There was no specialization.
Right, so everyone was a jack of all trades.
Exactly. But then Ridley argues that we reach a crucial turning point, the emergence of trade and specialization. And we can actually see evidence of this with early humans trading shell beads and stone tools across huge distances, long before we had any complex societies.
So this is where that idea of the collective brain comes in, right? The idea that progress isn't just about individual brilliance, but also about sharing knowledge and building on each other's ideas.
Exactly. Ridley uses this really fascinating example of the Tasmanians to highlight this. They were isolated for thousands of years, and what happened? Their technology actually regressed. Because their population was so small, they just couldn't maintain the knowledge and trade networks that are necessary for innovation to really take hold.
Yeah, it's like being stranded on a deserted island. You might survive, but you're not going to invent the internet.
Precisely. The Tasmanians really highlight just how vital exchange and interconnectedness are for progress.
It really makes you think about what makes trade with strangers possible in the first place. I mean, there has to be a certain level of trust involved, right?
Absolutely. And that's a question that Ridley tackles head on. He talks about this idea of trust juice, our innate human capacity for cooperation. He even brings in oxytocin, the trust hormone, and how it might actually play a role in our willingness to trust others, even complete strangers.
Okay, that's interesting.
Yeah.
How does he support that?
He points to the ultimatum game, which is a classic experiment in behavioral economics. It involves two players. Player A is given some money and has to decide how much to offer to player B. Now, player B can either accept the offer and they both keep their share, or they can reject it and no one gets anything.
So there's risk for both players.
Exactly. And the really interesting thing is that people are generally a lot more generous than you might expect. They don't always try to maximize their own profit at the expense of the other player. And here's the really interesting part. Studies have shown that people who have more experience in modern markets and trade tend to be even more generous in the ultimatum game.
Wow, so you're saying that trading with others, even strangers, might actually make us more cooperative.
That seems to be what the research suggests. It seems like engaging in trade actually fosters a sense of fairness and reciprocity, which are crucial for building trust and maintaining those healthy societies.
It makes you think about how we build trust online, too. Like eBay's reputation system, for example. Allows us to trust strangers, even in the digital world.
Yeah, it's like a modern adaptation of those ancient trust mechanisms Ridley talks about. But let's shift gears a bit and talk about the agricultural revolution. It's often seen as like the ultimate turning point for human progress, right?
Yeah, that moment when we went from hunter-gatherers to farmers. But Ridley throws us a bit of a curveball here, doesn't he?
He does. He argues that trade may have actually paved the way for agriculture in the first place. He suggests that specialization in trade created this incentive to produce surplus food, which made agriculture a viable and attractive option.
And he uses the Natufians as an example,
Yep.
right? They were on the verge of farming, but actually regressed during a period of climate change. Shows that progress isn't always a straight line forward.
Exactly. And then we have this fascinating story of Ötzi, the 5,000-year-old Iceman discovered in the Alps. His copper axe actually suggests that sophisticated trade networks were already in place even during this early agricultural period.
It's pretty amazing to think about those early trade routes, crisscrossing the continent. But wait a minute, didn't Ridley also talk about how technological progress isn't always a one-way street?
Absolutely. He uses the example of Japan around 1700 when they actually abandoned the plow in favor of the hoe.
Now, that sounds like a step backwards.
Yeah.
Why would they do that?
I know it seems counterintuitive, but it actually makes sense when you consider the context. Japan's population was exploding at the time, which meant that labor was cheaper than draft animals.
So it was actually more efficient to use human power, even with a simpler tool. That's fascinating.
It really highlights that technological choices aren't made in a vacuum. They're influenced by economic conditions, resource availability, and a whole bunch of other factors.
Okay, so we've talked about the importance of trade specialization and even the unexpected turns that progress can take. But what about the Industrial Revolution? What does Ridley see as the key driver behind that era of explosive growth?
He challenges that common idea that it was all about population growth. He draws on the work of Kenneth Pomerantz, who argued that Britain's success was due to this really unique combination of abundant coal and access to resources from the Americas. This allowed them to break free from that traditional Malthusian trap, where population growth just outstrips resources and leads to hardship.
So they had this 1-2 punch energy from coal and raw materials from across the Atlantic. What about other parts of the world?
Well, Ridley contrasts this with China, which, despite having all these early innovations, they lacked those key advantages. He argues that access to certain resources alongside cultural and political factors really played a big role in shaping how the Industrial Revolution played out.
It makes you wonder how history might have been different if those resources had been distributed differently. Speaking of resources, there's a big one that Ridley addresses head on. Fossil fuels.
Right. He acknowledges the environmental concerns, of course, but he argues that they've been absolutely fundamental to modern prosperity. And here's a thought-provoking point. He suggests that fossil fuels have actually led to more efficient land use.
Oh, that's interesting. How so?
Well, think about it. Before fossil fuels, we needed huge amounts of land just to grow wood for fuel or to harness wind and water power. Fossil fuels really concentrated energy production, which freed up all that land for other uses like agriculture or conservation.
So it's a trade-off, but one that has really shaped the landscapes we see today.
Precisely. And as we transition to new energy sources, it's important to keep those land use implications in mind.
It's like we're constantly trying to solve one problem without creating another one, right?
Mm-hmm.
But this all ties back to Ridley's optimism. He seems to believe that we'll find solutions even when it comes to something as big as climate change.
Yeah, he doesn't deny the seriousness of climate change at all. But he points out that even the IPCC scenarios predict significant economic growth in this century, even with climate change factored in. He argues that wealthier societies are just far better equipped to adapt to environmental challenges.
He uses some pretty compelling examples too, right? Like the fact that the death rate from natural disasters is decreasing even as storms are potentially becoming more intense.
Exactly. And he highlights how malaria was actually widespread even during cooler periods. Controlling it depends more on development than on temperature, really. He even pushes back on some of the more alarmist claims around coral reefs, pointing out that they've survived even warmer periods historically. Local threats, he argues, are often more damaging than climate change itself.
So it's about acknowledging the problem, but focusing on solutions and resilience rather than just getting stuck in fear. But let's go back to this idea of progress. What does Ridley ultimately see as the driving force?
He comes back to this power of human ingenuity, our ability to innovate and adapt. He believes that just as we found ways to harness the power of coal, oil, and gas, we'll find ways to harness the power of the sun, wind, tides, and whatever else the future holds.
Like that saying, necessity is the mother of invention. Remember that analogy he uses?
The bicycle.
Yes. He talks about how the invention of the bicycle wasn't just about someone coming up with the idea of 2 wheels and a frame. It was about all the incremental innovations that followed. The gears, the brakes, the tires, the suspension. Each one building on the last, leading to a better and better product.
It's a perfect way to visualize how progress actually happens. It's rarely about one big eureka moment. It's about countless small steps, each building on the work of those who came before.
And that's where that collective brain idea comes in again, right?
Mhm.
The power of shared knowledge and collaboration.
Exactly. It's not just about individual genius. It's about that network of ideas, that constant exchange and refinement that drives progress.
Which brings us right back to trade and specialization, those fundamental building blocks that Ridley keeps emphasizing.
He sees them as essential for unlocking human potential, for fostering the kind of collaboration that leads to innovation and prosperity.
And ultimately, that's what his book is all about. A belief in the power of human ingenuity, a call for optimism even in the face of challenges. But I'm curious, doesn't he address those who might be skeptical of his optimism? I mean, the world certainly has its share of problems.
He does. He acknowledges that there will always be people who tend to focus on the negative. The ones who only see the problems and not the progress.
But how does he respond to that? Does he think we should just ignore the bad stuff?
Not at all. It's not about having blind faith or ignoring the very real challenges. His point is that pessimism can be a self-fulfilling prophecy. If we just believe that things are only going to get worse, we're much less likely to try to make them better.
So it's about mindset.
Yeah.
About believing in our ability to find solutions.
Exactly. Ridley argues that throughout history, whenever we've been faced with these seemingly impossible challenges, humanity has always found a way to overcome them.
Like that saying, it's always darkest before the dawn.
Exactly. He uses the example of those anxieties back in the 19th century about all the horse manure piling up in cities. I mean, it seemed like an unsolvable problem at the time, but then along came the automobile, and it totally transformed transportation and, ironically enough, cleaned up the streets, too.
That's a great example of how these unexpected innovations can totally change the game.
Right. And he points to other historical triumphs, too, like the eradication of smallpox, the development of antibiotics, the Green Revolution. These were all incredible achievements that seemed impossible at the time. But they happened because people believed in human ingenuity and worked together to make a difference.
So he's saying don't underestimate the power of humans to innovate, especially when we work together.
That's the core of his message. He wants us to be rational optimists, to acknowledge the progress that we've made and face challenges head on, but above all, to believe in our ability to create a better future.
And that brings us back to his central thesis, the power of exchange and specialization.
He sees them as those twin engines of prosperity, the forces that have driven humanity's journey from those early hand axe makers to the complex world we live in today.
It's incredible to think about. And as we look to the future, it's not about knowing exactly what that future holds. It's about being open to the possibility that we can solve these problems, that we can continue to innovate and adapt, and that we can create a world where everyone has the chance to thrive.
It's about understanding that we're all part of this experiment called humanity, and that our collective efforts, both big and small, can shape the course of history.
Wow. Well, I think we've done a great job unpacking the Rational Optimist today. But now we want to hear from you. What really resonated with you from today's deep dives? What new forms of exchange and collaboration do you think might emerge in the future to solve the challenges we're facing?
We're all in this together, and who knows what incredible things we can achieve when we combine our knowledge, our creativity, and our belief in a brighter future.
Well said. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep believing in the power of human progress.